specifically on specifically on these topics. He's very thoughtful. He's spent a lot of time thinking through these things, and he's also able to articulate it in a way that is palatable and easy to digest. So listen, take notes. I think you're in for a treat. Adam Tucker is in charge of team at SES, Southern Evangelical Seminary, which is where I went to seminary, where Grant's actually going now. And he used to be the Ratio Christi chapter director at UNCG, and he was there for a couple years before he went back to SES, and he's been there for now, we've been 2 years? A couple years?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, I don't know, do you want to maybe just give another plug? We gave one, give another plug for the conference, and then take it away.
Alrighty. Well, hello everyone. Good to see everybody, or at least the back of your heads tonight. Sorry that you have to look at my head, I apologize. But let me share my screen here. And there we go. You guys see that okay? Alright, I don't know what's funny, but I'm glad you can see it.
We see ourselves.
There you go. Alright, well I'm going to go ahead and mash play. Alright, is that showing up on your end?
Yes.
Awesome. So just another quick plug for the seminary. I've been on staff there for 2 years, but I was a student there. I was one of the special ones who turned a 2-year degree into 9. So it takes a really special person to do that. So if you guys like what Ratio Christi does, Ratio Christi was actually birthed out of SES. So you can talk to Aaron, you can talk to Grant if you're interested in going deeper in studying these sorts of issues. And you can audit classes if you don't want to do a degree. We have a lay institute that's just an online self-study type of thing that you can do for relatively cheaply. And then we have our mobile app also that we put a lot of our talks from the national conference and those sorts of things on. I would encourage you to check out our blog, ses.edu/blog. We call it Why Do You Believe? Is the name of the blog. So a lot of good stuff on there, podcasts that we put up occasionally as well. So we point you to that, and of course our national conference that I think you've already heard about. It's less than 2 weeks, hard to believe, but it's a ton of fun. I hope you guys are able to come. If you come for the whole weekend and stay for the Ratio Christi Symposium, that's always a great time being with like-minded folks and just having fun, challenging each other, learning yourself. It's just a great weekend, so I hope you're able to take advantage of that. Excuse me, I've got a frog in my throat tonight. So again, would encourage you to do that if you're able. So that is the end of my commercial, I believe. So that's not what you guys came to hear about. So let's jump into the topic for this evening, and I'll be the first to admit this is not an easy thing or necessarily a fun thing to discuss. And just so you know, I can't see you guys anymore. I only see my slides currently. So Aaron, just stop me if anybody has a question or whatever. We can interrupt and do that. So it looks like I'm looking at you, but I actually don't see anything but my slides. So just let me know if you have a question. But we'll try to do this in a way that I hope is very respectful and genuine, but also uncompromising, because it doesn't do anyone any good to kind of beat around the bush and just not really dive into the actual issues here. But, amongst the many culturally divisive issues that we're facing in our culture, which seem to be multiplying on a daily basis, it seems like everybody can agree on at least one thing. If we look at pop culture and look at the number of songs that are written about love every year, the number of books and TV shows and movies that revolve around this thing we call love, it seems like everyone agrees whatever love is, it's important, and we need to focus on that. I looked up, this was a couple of years ago, 2016, the National Retail Federation estimated that we would spend nearly $20 billion for Valentine's Day to express some type of quote-unquote love related to this holiday. So again, love, whatever that means, is very popular topic and something, again, I think we can all agree on that it's important. I mean, goodness, look at all the different dating websites to find the love of your life. I mean, you can even go to farmersonly.com. If you're a farmer and you're looking just for that one special someone, and they gotta find the love of your life site for just anyone and everyone these days. But the problem is we use the word love in so many different ways. I love my wife. I love my kids. I love the Carolina Tar Heels. I love pizza. I love snowboarding. Do I mean love in the same way in all of those things? Do I love my wife in the same way that I love pizza? What do we mean there? Well, the video may be a little choppy, and some of you may have seen this before, but I want to play a video of at least one idea of what love may look like.
I love my sister so much.
It's amazing. It's amazing. How you like, oh my God, look at this guy. It's beautiful.
My favorite part was when we put on sensors and went into the box so we could dance and it would be like our skeletons would be in the screen of the box.
Look at people react like so beautiful.
On Valentine's Day 2015, a group of families, couples, and friends took part in a unique event with a very simple message. Love has no gender, no race, no age, no disability, no labels.
Our nation was founded on a bedrock principle. We are all created equal. Progress on this journey often comes in small increments, held by the persistent effort of dedicated citizens.
I know that Valentine's Day is coming up and it's full of love and it has a beautiful message. But remember, love is an everyday and every minute thing. It's not just on Valentine's Day.
Love has no labels.
This morning, the Supreme Court recognized that the Constitution guarantees marriage equality.
It's really something. It's really just about support. Finding, if you have one person who loves and supports you for who you are, then you can hold on to that person in your life.
Nothing but stopping for loving and living.
Love is what you make, life is what you fight.
Really, love is life.
They're no different than they were when you were younger.
I love you all. Please make my day. There are a lot of people in the world still struggling to have peace and love. That's why Love Has No Labels have to continue sending the same message to get to the lost person on earth, so they feel what we feel.
If we dare to peek behind the screen of our eyes, we'll find that with love, we're all the same. We are all human. This Valentine's Day, share your story and show the world that love has no limits.
All right, Aaron, you guys still there?
Yeah, we're good.
All right, awesome. And you hear, and you probably know that song, you hear 1 Corinthians 13 being quoted in the background there, but it certainly pulls at your heartstrings a little bit, because there's a lot of truth in what's being said there. But I think there's a whole lot of error, hopefully, as I'll be able to point out as we go on. So that doesn't really define love, but it certainly gives us their idea of what love is not. And actually, in one of the clips, you may have heard someone did define love, their view of love, that love is whatever you make it. It's whatever you want it to be. Now, I'll give away one of the punchlines, and if you think through that commercial logically, the only thing that follows from that commercial and that whole setup is that everybody has a skeleton. That's the only thing that follows from anything that they were doing there. But obviously, that's not the point they're trying to make. So if we get, I hear some background noise. You guys good? You guys with me?
Yeah, we're good.
Oh, okay. Just making sure because I can't see it. So this happens when the Supreme Court made their ruling a while back. President Obama said, "We've made our union a little more perfect. Those who fought for same-sex marriage slowly made an entire country realize that love is love. And then the White House was tweeting out using the hashtag love wins. So notice what he's saying, love is love, realizing that love is love is said to make our country more perfect. That is, more the way it ought to be. And so the implication is those who disagree with this idea that love is love make our country a little more imperfect, a little more the way it not ought to be. So these kind of phrases or bumper sticker kind of slogans of love wins or love is love or those sorts of things really are being wielded like swords in our culture against those who disagree, specifically with homosexual behavior, same-sex marriage, now transgenderism as the new big thing. So why is that? Why has this shift happened? Well, I think one big reason for this is because our culture has redefined love using one word in particular. Anybody have an idea of what that may be, what that word may be? Just shout it out because I can't see any hands.
Someone said equality.
Close, yeah. I think it's this word. Affirm. Love now equals affirmation in our culture. I've heard it explicitly stated more than once that in order to truly love someone, we must affirm their beliefs, values, and by implication, behaviors, if we really want to love someone. So since I've asked this question in a forum before, and one of the speakers said, well, it depends on what you mean by affirm. Here's the dictionary definition of affirm. To validate or confirm, to state positively, to assert as valid or confirmed, or to express dedication to. We had a debate at the seminary just a few weeks ago on this very question, must love equal affirmation? And the two opposing viewpoints both agreed, yes, love must equal affirmation if we're truly going to love someone. Now, they couldn't maintain that position throughout the debate, as we'll see. We'll see why that's the case, but that is the position that they at least verbally assented to. So the idea, of course, is using homosexuality or homosexual behavior as an example. If we don't celebrate that or affirm that, then we're not actually loving those engaged in those particular behaviors. And of course, as we just heard again from the song, oftentimes 1 Corinthians 13 is invoked to prove this point. Love is patient, love is kind, and those are the things that we need to be in order to actually love someone. So if someone feels their desires aren't being affirmed, then they don't feel like they're being loved. And oftentimes they actually feel like they're being hated or rejected or attacked, as the case may be. So that's resulted in this idea of safe zones. I'm sure you guys are probably familiar with this term. It's a pretty big movement on campuses and even in the corporate world. This idea that there are safe spaces to go, to be with like-minded folks, not to have your views challenged, not to be questioned in any way, just to be affirmed. This is how UNC Greensboro discusses or explains safe zones. So UNCG's Safe Zone is a campus group of student, faculty, and staff allies that support gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersex, and asexual individuals who promote understanding, acceptance, and appreciation of our LGBTQ students. Now, if all of that meant was to promote understanding, acceptance, and appreciation of these students as human beings, then obviously I agree with that. But that's not what is being actually implied with this whole movement of safe zones. So I'll give you another example. This is from the website Campus Cry, which I'm sure you can imagine what the website's about. LGBT students need to know who on campus is safe and supportive. So in other words, if I'm safe, that means I support your behavior, your lifestyle choices. In other words, I affirm them. This is from Wesleyan University in Connecticut, this next quote, about a building they have on campus called Open House. It says, Open House is a safe space for generating interest and a celebration of queer life from the social to the political to the academic. So again, this moves much beyond just affirming people as human beings. This is a celebration supporting, affirming particular behaviors and identities and feelings and those sorts of things. And in fact, Open House goes on to list 15 letters representing different sexual preferences and gender identities that are welcome at Open House. And I haven't looked at that in a while, but I can only imagine that that list has probably grown and expanded, as I'm sure 15 letters wasn't enough to incorporate everyone, and they were being too exclusive in that for someone's taste. So here's the problem. I agree that we should love others. I think the Bible is clear on that as well. Hopefully we all are in agreement on that. And honestly, after engaging with many individuals on the opposing side, I honestly believe most of them are motivated by love. That they really do want to love other people. So both sides of this debate say we're motivated by love. Yet we come to opposite conclusions on what loving others looks like. So of course that leads to the question, who's right? How can we possibly know? And of course Ratio Christi doesn't struggle with this, but a lot of Christians and well-meaning Christian ministries will struggle with answering this question by just quoting Bible verses. And well, the Bible's clear, it says X, Y, Z. But of course that falls on deaf ears to many in our culture, because the Bible isn't magic just because we happen to quote a Bible verse. It's not read or understood in a vacuum. Why does God say what he does about sexuality in the Bible? And how do I know the Bible is an authority to be trusted and adhered to in the first place? I may as well be quoting the Quran if I was a Muslim. But of course, if I'm quoting to the Quran to a Christian, they would say, so what? I don't find the Quran authoritative. Why should I care? And I think looking at these things in a more philosophical way really gives us that foundation to go deeper than just, well, the Bible says so. Well, why does it say that? And why does God say what he does and command what he does about our human sexuality? So I think we can better challenge this misguided understanding of love and, of course, of hate by implication behind these slogans like love is love and love wins and so on and so forth by looking at three questions that I want us to spend some time on tonight. What is good? What is love? And then what now? So if you're interested, I will make a PDF deck of these slides and I'll post them on our team page on the SES website. So go to ses.edu/team. And then there's a link off to the side called post-event materials, and I'll just have it labeled with tonight's meeting. I can post the PDF there. So if you guys are interested in getting these slides. So let's jump into the first question. Again, interrupt me as you need to, or just wait till the end, and that'll be fine too. What is good? What do we mean by good? Because hopefully we can all agree if we don't have an actual objective understanding or meaning of good, that's true for all people in all times and all places, then it really boils down to mere opinions. And there's no way to say hate speech or bullying or shooting people in Las Vegas or whatever the case may be is actually bad or actually evil. Because if we can't say what is good, then we certainly can't say what is evil. And of course, like love, we use the word good in all sorts of different ways. You know, we had some good supper a while ago. You guys have a really good Ratio Christi chapter. The weather was really good today. You know, what do we mean by good? What exactly is good? So let's jump into that just a bit. What do we mean by good? Well, it's not whatever we happen to like, whatever we choose, whatever we decide, whatever we feel like. Good has a very specific meaning and classically understood, that is, for the majority of human history, using good thinking to steal the word there, good is that which fulfills the end or the purpose of something according to that thing's nature, according to what that thing is. Now, I'll unpack this in just a minute. It's much more simple than it may at first appear. So, for example, we can know what a tree is. And what makes for a good tree, or a good apple, or in this case, a good human being. because we know what human beings are and the ends towards which our various faculties are directed, so we can determine what constitutes the good of human beings. So this brings us finally to moral goodness, because an eye that doesn't see well, that has nothing to do with morality. But moral goodness enters the picture because we're rational beings capable of knowing things about reality and making choices about those things, because we have intellects and wills. So here's the argument for moral goodness. We all pursue what we take to be good for us. That is, whatever we think is good, that is what we pursue. Now, sometimes we're wrong about that and we pursue the wrong things, but we still think those things are good. So even in extreme cases, like, I don't want to be insensitive, but this is the most obvious example currently. Even with the shooting yesterday, that was ultimate evil, no question about it. But I can guarantee you the shooter didn't do that because he thought it was evil. For whatever demented reason he had, he saw some good in that action, or else he wouldn't have pursued it. If you could see me more, and you probably see enough, all you need to see, you can see that I like to eat pizza and chocolate probably too much. And I know that I shouldn't. But I still take the taste, or whatever the case may be, of the good of those things, outweighing the fact that I know I would be better off not to eat those things. So we're still pursuing what we take to be good for us. So as rational beings, reason tells us what is actually good for us. Therefore, the rational, or we could say the moral person, will pursue what is actually good for them. Now, of course, then the question arises, why should anyone be rational and why should anyone be moral? Well, the answer to that is twofold: truth and goodness. Because just like our other faculties, our intellect is directed towards the truth, knowing reality as it is, knowing truth about reality. And our wills are directed towards the good. It can't be different. We can corrupt those things and be mistaken in our judgments, but the fact that we're directed towards the true and towards the good can't be otherwise. And if you disagree with me, you actually make my point, because you would be saying, hey, wait a minute, that's not true. And I would say, aha, you only want to believe things that are true, don't you? Things you have reason to believe, because that is just the nature of your intellect. Now, this seems to be patently obvious upon a moment's reflection, but we've rejected this in our culture. But let me use Richard Dawkins, the famous atheist, as an example of how you can't escape this type of reasoning. So in his book, The River Out of Eden, he says this: in a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, just electrons and selfish genes, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky. You won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. Now, you may have heard that quote before. Notice what he's saying. There's no design, there's no purpose, no ends towards which things are directed. Therefore, there can't be evil, and there can't be good. Just blind, pitiless indifference. Yet in the God delusion, he talks about a man named Kurt Wise. Kurt Wise was a Harvard-trained geologist, studied under the famous Stephen Jay Gould, the famous paleontologist. Kurt is a Christian. He's actually a young earth creationist. I don't care how old the earth is, not here to discuss that. Doesn't matter to me. But he's a young earth creationist. And he was convinced he couldn't have a career in a secular academia and hold to the views that he holds as a young earth creationist. So he left secular academia, and I think he runs a science department at one of the seminaries, one of the evangelical seminaries now. So in The God Delusion, Dawkins says this about Kurt Wise. He says, I am hostile to fundamentalist religion because it subverts science and saps the intellect. The Kurt Wise story is just plain pathetic and contemptible. The wound to his career and his life's happiness was self-inflicted, so unnecessary, so easy to escape. I am hostile to religion because of what it did to Kurt Weiss, and if it did that to a Harvard-educated geologist, just think what it can do to others less gifted and less well-armed. Now notice what he's saying here. It subverts science. Now if you read other writings by Dawkins, he holds that science is the only means of knowing truth about reality. So he's implicitly saying to subvert science is to sap the intellect, to avoid pursuing truth, as he sees it, with your intellect. But Dawkins, you just told me there is no purpose to anything. So our intellects can't be directed towards truth. Science can't be the means of finding truth with my intellect. He says doing this, subverting science and zapping the intellect, is pathetic and contemptible. How can that be if there are no purposes towards which we're directed? He even says that it affects our life's happiness to do this, not to use our faculties in the way in which they're intended, not to pursue their good. He says affects your life's happiness, and he's right about that. But on his view of reality, he can't hold that view consistently. If there is no purpose to anything, if there is no evil and thus no good, just blind, pitiless indifference. So you can only fight reality so far before reality fights back. And you can't live this no meaning, no purpose kind of idea consistently at all and actually live as a human being. So, of course, then we ask the question, therefore, is homosexual behavior, gender fluidity, or same-sex marriage, or other sorts of things good? And again, I'm specifically talking about homosexual behavior here. There's a difference between having desires versus acting on those particular behaviors. Hopefully that'll be clear as we continue. So it follows from what we talked about that these behaviors are contrary to the good set for us by our human nature. Okay? So these types of sexual behaviors are contrary to reality as our existing as men or women, and they're also contrary to both the procreative and the unitive ends, this dual end of our sexual faculties. Now, just to maybe head off a question that may come up from someone, this doesn't mean that our faculties don't have other ends. Some of our faculties have multiple ends. And it doesn't mean that we can't use those faculties for other things. For example, the purpose of my lungs and my respiratory system is to take in oxygen and oxygenate my blood, right? Keeps me alive. That doesn't mean I can't use my respiratory system to blow up a balloon. There's nothing wrong with that. Perfectly fine. But it is wrong to use my respiratory system to sniff paint thinner. Because that is completely contrary to the purpose of your respiratory system. Right? Hopefully that makes sense. So I can, I can eat a little bit of junk food because it's, in moderation is okay. But I can't eat an ashtray because it's not food. It's completely contrary to the purpose of my digestive system. So likewise, our sexual faculties have this dual end of procreation and unity. Whether one is superior to the other or whatever, that's a different debate. But to use those in a way that is completely contrary to those ends just is what we mean by bad, not pursuing their good. So then it follows, are such behaviors good? Well, they can't be. Sorry, I jumped ahead there. Let me go back to this. The answer, if everything we've said so far is true, the answer has to be necessarily no. They can't be good, regardless of the reason someone may have for desiring these things. And no more so than, say, an alcoholic who never hurts anyone, lives by himself, never drives, doesn't have any family, just wants to sit in his apartment all day and drink himself silly. And maybe he has a completely 100% genetic disposition to do so. It doesn't make it good. or right or anything to be celebrated. It's contrary to multiple ends for multiple faculties as a human being to do such things. So it doesn't matter the reason for having these behaviors. We're asking, are the behaviors themselves good? And the answer necessarily has to be no. But our culture, and sadly the church oftentimes, has completely rejected all this view of natures and ends of things, purposes towards things. It's called teleology. Maybe you've heard that term before. We've rejected that view and oftentimes have absorbed this view called nominalism. So your $5 word for the day, if you've never heard that. Nominalism. So maybe it sounds crazy, maybe you don't like philosophy or whatever, but I can assure you ideas have consequences. And this idea of nominalism, the fact that we reject that things have natures. There is no human nature that we share in common. We're just all individual things that for the sake of convenience we label as human. But there is no actual human nature that we all share in common. This is or treeness or any types of universal ideas that we talk about. Nominalism rejects all of that. And so this kind of view ends up ultimately elevating man's will over reality. And it removes any firm foundation from which we can form moral judgments. And ultimately it ends in the relativism that we often see or at least hear about. So the good is whatever each individual person happens to desire at any particular moment. So we see this played out even amongst people who should know better. So this is Justice Kennedy from the Supreme Court. He was the author of the majority opinion in the same-sex marriage case. This is from a 1992 ruling in Planned Parenthood versus Casey. Kennedy says, at the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. It's a Supreme Court justice saying you get to define reality for yourself. Now, of course, the problem is, why does he get to define reality for me? Maybe my idea of reality is that we don't define reality for ourselves. Who is he to say that applies to everyone? It's completely self-defeating. It's just nonsense. But look at what he's saying there. The heart of liberty is the right to define your own concept of what it means to be a human. Anything goes if that is true. And whoever happens to get a group together that agrees on something, well, then they have the power to enforce their particular views and this, that, and the other, and fight makes right, and all those sorts of things. But you've removed any foundation to claim that anything is actually good or actually evil. And you're a justice on the United States Supreme Court. That's a scary thought, folks. That's something that should never happen. And hopefully that gives you a good example of where we are as a culture. But the point of all this is simply, if there is no objective standard of what we mean by good, then we can't say anything is evil. We can't say that not affirming behaviors is evil. We can't say that bullying is evil. We can't say that hate speech is evil, or any of these sorts of things. And of course, I think all those things are evil, by the way. But if we reject an objective standard of good, then we've removed our ability to coherently say any of those things are actually evil. But of course, as we've argued, there is such a standard of good and what we mean by good, and so we can make objective moral judgments. So finally, that gets us to the meat of this. What do we mean by love, then? Because again, just like good, we use the word love in a million different ways. Well, I imagine you guys are smart enough to see that just with a moment's reflection, love can't mean affirming all the beliefs, values, and behaviors of everyone. Because I can tell you, I've been on the receiving end of those who don't affirm my beliefs, values, and behaviors, and they didn't act very loving towards me. So either they didn't believe what they're saying, or they really don't care about loving everyone, or they're just thoroughly confused, which I think is probably the case. In the debate we had at the seminary I mentioned a bit ago, it priceless, which you can find on our SES Facebook page. The archive live stream is there in the video section. But during the Q&A, one young lady got up, and she had been raised by a lesbian couple. Young, pretty, college-age girl, I would say. Very brave, in tears. And she was asking those affirming that we had to define love as affirmation. She said, I was abused. I was abandoned. I was emotionally abused by these women. I was abandoned as they changed partners and all these sorts of things. Are you telling me if I'm going to love them as my parents that I have to affirm how they treated me? And one of the debaters got up out of her chair, came down, gave the young lady a hug, and very pastoral, handled it well in that sense. And she said, I'm so sorry that happened to you. I would never advocate anyone treating you or anyone else that way. But you can still respect them as your parents, even though, and love them as your parents, even though we understand that behavior should never be advocated or celebrated. And then she sat down. And Michael Brown, who was one of our debaters, picked up the microphone and he said, thus, we see you can love someone without affirming their behavior, and put the mic down. That was the whole debate. If that one few moments happened, that would have been the whole debate. Because she just proved the point that love does not and cannot solely equal affirmation. Now, I do think love involves affirmation, but what exactly are we to affirm? Well, I imagine with Aaron being a good SES guy, you've probably heard about Thomas Aquinas a time or two. And Thomas Aquinas says this. It says, to love anything is nothing else than to will good to that thing. Our love, whereby we will good to anything, is not the cause of its goodness, but conversely, its goodness, whether real or imaginary, calls forth our love, by which we will that it should preserve the good it has, and receive besides the good it has not. And to this end, we direct our actions. In other words, love is to will the good of another. And what is the good? Well, as we've already said, it's that which fulfills the end or purpose of something according to its nature. So our feelings about the good can be wrong, and we all have desires on which we ought not act. So we can't judge good just on our feelings or our desires. Our will should follow our intellect, rather than the reverse that we see in our culture. So our will should follow our intellect, and our emotions should be based on and judged by what we know about reality. So we can know, for example, the good of human sexuality, and we should therefore pursue that good and help others do the same. And interestingly enough, that's just what the Bible says in 1 Corinthians 13, the great love chapter, which often gets quoted to try to prove the opposite. But if we read it in context, novel idea, it says this: love is patient, love is kind, love does not envy, is not boastful, is not conceited, does not act improperly, is not selfish, is not provoked, and does not keep a record of wrongs. Love finds no joy in unrighteousness, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. And interestingly enough, in this chapter, Paul goes on to talk about avoiding childish thinking. And we've got a lot of childish thinking inside and outside the church when it comes to these types of things. So what about someone like a Bruce Jenner, for example? So we've kind of used the example of homosexual behavior, but what about someone like a Bruce Jenner who's not homosexual, but just desires to be the opposite sex? I actually have a friend who identifies as asexual. Is it loving to affirm and celebrate and encourage these desires? Now, tactically speaking, there may be some times, I think, not violating your own personal conscience on that. There may be some times where, we don't necessarily push against what they're thinking or feeling or doing at the moment, because we want to build that relationship and be able to do that properly at some point. But for example, my friend who identifies as asexual, he started a different Facebook page for this new identity that he had. And he laid out all these ground rules if you were going to be his friend. And you didn't use this, that, or the other pronoun, and use this name or that name and not this one, and all these sorts of things. And so I messaged him, and it is a him, and we'll get to that in a minute, but I messaged him and said, hey, would still love to be your friend and interact and all these things. And so, well, did you see the ground rules for being my friend? He said, yeah, sure did. And, I do genuinely love you and want the best for you. And so I promised to do my best to abide by those. Never confirmed my friend request. But what I did in that, I never referred to him as him or his actual name or any of those things, but I also didn't refer to him in the ways that he wanted to be referred to. I just wrote my sentences such that I didn't have to do either one, and could be somewhat ambiguous with that and not violate my conscience and not offend him in the process. But even that wasn't good enough because he wanted affirmation and celebration rather than actual tolerance that we talk about as a virtue in this culture. So is it loving ultimately to affirm these types of feelings and behaviors? Well, again, what is love? Willing the good for another. Is it good to mutilate our bodies and pretend we're not either male or female, and to pursue the purposes of our bodies as male or female? Well, according to what we've looked at so far, the answer is no. It's not good, and so it would actually be hate for me to affirm and celebrate you being something you're not. To actually will your annihilation as who you are. That would be the least loving thing that I could do for you. So why is it hate to say someone's desires are misdirected, but in this case it's not hate to say someone has the wrong body? Because they're saying, oh, I'm really female, but I was born with this male body. Or so, oh, I'm so sorry you have the wrong body. And that's somehow loving and affirming, but it's hate to say, I'm so sorry your desires are confused and misdirected. That's just moving the goalpost and not playing fair. So let's talk for just a minute about what is a human being. And I think this is one of the keys to understanding this whole debate here. And this goes back to the whole nominalism move in our culture for the last several hundred years. That again, ideas have consequences. It's led to these various ways of thinking. So human beings, I would argue, and I'm going to assert some things without a lot of argument because we don't have time to get into everything, but human beings we're not merely our bodies, nor are we merely our desires. A human being is a body-soul composite. You're not a soul that drives this meat machine. Freaky Friday and all those sorts of crazy stories make for good movies, body swapping and soul swapping and all that sort of stuff. But it's fiction. You're a body-soul composite to make a human being. So it's actually impossible to have the wrong body, because your physicalness is just as important as your immaterial aspect. If you have a male body, then what is good for you sexually is what is good for a male, and likewise for a female. So it's impossible to have the wrong body, but it's certainly very possible to have the wrong desires. And so to deny the truth of our sex or our gender, or the truth of our rationality, is ultimately to deny reality and to deny who we are and what we are. This is why Christians await the resurrection. That's why the resurrection is so important. Because to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord, yes, but only in a incomplete sense, in an incomplete way. That's why people that die prior to the second coming of Christ await resurrection, because they're just a soul now. They're incomplete. They're waiting for that soul to be reunited with a perfected body so they can be a complete human being again. So again, this is a very biblical view of humanity. So again, the good of our sexual faculties as man or as woman is determined by the human nature that we have. A part of that human nature is being either male or female. So let's skip ahead just a little bit here and talk about the obvious question that always comes up. What about those born intersexed, where we're not sure if they're male or female? Well, those born truly intersexed occurs in about 0.018% of the population. So what we've been talking about all night is called natural law, looking at the nature of things and determining what is good for those things. So we're talking generally speaking. That's not to say that there are times when determining what is good for that thing may be difficult, or determining what that thing is may be difficult. Now, in this particular instance, we know that these people are valuable human beings, even if we're not sure if they're male or female. But we know genetically, generally speaking, they're either male or female. So what happens in this case is this presents an epistemological challenge. We know ontologically, that is, the nature of them as human beings, they're either male or female, even though they may give the appearance of being the opposite or being a mixture. And so for us to immediately know epistemologically whether they're male or female, that may be difficult, and we may have limited resources to make that determination. But it doesn't change the fact that they are either male or female, and it doesn't change the fact that genetic disorders happen. But it doesn't change that the good towards which they're directed is determined by their nature. But we know disorders happen all the time. The fact that people are born blind doesn't change the fact that eyes are meant to see. They're the kinds of things that see, even though they don't always function properly. Likewise, just because people are sometimes born with some genetic disorder regarding their sexual organs and things doesn't change that they're valuable human beings who are either male or female. And we've made some really terrible mistakes along the way, and I'm not denying any of that. And it's sad in these difficult situations. I'm not denying any of that either. But it still doesn't change reality. Because the fact is, again, we all have desires on which we ought not act. And you may struggle with the wrong desires, and ultimately the right desires may never come. Possibly. That could be a lifelong struggle. But the choice is still ours to act on those desires or not. And again, I think even those who disagree with all of this that I've said tonight agree with this, especially on the college campus, because we hear a lot about the rape culture. And well, sex can be whatever you want it to be as long as there's consent. Why is consent important? You mean to have a right as a human being not to be sexually violated? Where did that right come from? Does the government give me that? Does the campus give me that? Do I have that by virtue of being a human being? Because of my human nature. Because that is one of the goods towards which I am directed. Likewise, all of my sexual faculties are directed towards those goods. And just because I may have a genetic predisposition to do whatever doesn't change the fact that I am still in control of my actions. Like all things being equal, of course. Alrighty, and of course we're just talking natural law here. That's not to mention the work of the Holy Spirit in our lives and those sorts of things are for Christians to help us overcome sin and these desires that we struggle against. So one last serious note here, because I've been accused of this, and this is a common tactic I see a lot. But some will say the views that I've laid out tonight ultimately leads people to kill themselves or to harm themselves because they're not feeling loved, they're not feeling affirmed, and so they ultimately end up doing something horrible. And nothing ever should lead someone to kill themselves, to cut themselves, to harm themselves. If that is something you're struggling with, please seek help. Talk to Aaron, talk to me, talk to someone. Nothing should lead anyone to do that. But if we actually look at the situation in reality, the fact is there are usually other factors co-occurring in someone. It's called comorbidity that would lead someone to ultimately harm themselves. So, for example, Dr. Paul McHugh, who's the psychiatrist in chief at Johns Hopkins, he actually stopped performing sex change operations, I think back in the 70s, due to his post-surgery findings. So he found that even though these people didn't always regret their sex change, although I'm sure some did, and I'm using sex change in quotes here because I don't think that's actually possible, they didn't always regret the actual surgery. They still had the same emotional and sociological, interpersonal problems, psychological problems that they had pre-surgery. Just thinking, oh, surgery will solve everything. No. They had many other factors going on within themselves and within their lives that just manifested itself as this desire, in this case, to be the opposite sex. But that wasn't the actual issue. There were many other things going on, and the sex change, in this case, didn't even help at all. And again, a person is not their desires. Their desires do not define them. And again, the reason for those desires makes no difference to the goodness or badness of those desires. And as we've said a couple of times now, we all have desires on which we ought not act. All human beings are valuable. We're directed towards the good, and the loving thing to do is to point people to the actual good. As Michael Brown says, we're to point people to Jesus. Jesus sets you free. He doesn't lead you to kill yourself. Jesus leads to freedom because he's truth incarnate. He's the good itself. So I was having lunch with one of the guys at UNCW one time that totally disagreed with me. He was a campus minister for a liberal campus group, and we had some issues because of some of the things I had blogged about after one of their events and some of these types of things. And I firmly believe this guy was led by love. He loved his students. He had some students that had attempted suicide, that were harming themselves, different things. He was led by love, and therefore was lashing out at me and trying to stop groups like Ratio Christi and other places from speaking out against these things because he thought it did harm to his students. And I wish I would have had the guts to actually say this to him at the lunch, but I am more and more and more convinced that he was actually digging the grave for his students. He had the shovel in his hand because he's feeding this misconception that we are merely our desires, and that if someone doesn't affirm my desires, then they don't love me, and I'm no good, and I'm not valuable, and so I may as well just kill myself. Because he's fueled this misunderstanding of what it means to be a human being and what the good for humanity is. I don't think he did that intentionally, but that's exactly what he was doing. And that is what was digging those students' graves. Not the truth. The truth does not lead to that. And we've got to be brave enough to stand up and say that in love, in respect, in gentleness, in this culture. So we looked at what good is, looked at what love is. So what now? Again, I think people on both sides of this issue are motivated by what they think love is. But we've seen what it actually is, to will the good of another. And the good, again, is that which fulfills the inner purpose of something according to its nature. So we can see that God says what he does about sexuality because he wills our good. He's the author of our nature. He created it and sustains us in existence at every moment that we exist, so he can't not will our good. He can only ever will what is ultimately good for us. And in the final end of things, he is that ultimate good, that ultimate end that we're all desiring, whether we realize it or not. And so when we seek after something we think is good, and we're wrong about that, we're seeking the good in the wrong way. That's just what we call sin. So at the end of the day, we need to appeal to people's reason, and we need to talk about these things, but ultimately, it comes down to a heart change, to a matter of the will. Now, the will can accept what the mind rejects as true. Remember, true and good. The mind sees what is true, and the will follows to seek that as good. So we have to know what is true, but ultimately it comes down to a matter of the will. And we've seen that what we ought to do is based on what we are, and we can know this. And trying to be something we're not is not freedom. That's willing our annihilation. Willing to be something we're not. Os Guinness puts it this way. He says, freedom is not the permission to do what you like. It's the power to do what you ought. And what we ought to do is pursue what is actually good for us. But we all struggle with that. None of us do that perfectly. And that is the whole reason we need a Savior. It's the whole reason Jesus, God in human flesh, lived on this earth, lived the perfect life as a man ought to live, died on the cross, taking the punishment for our sins, being raised from the dead, defeating death, hell, and the grave, so that we don't have to do it ourselves, because we can't do it ourselves. Therefore, Paul can say in Galatians 5:1, it was for freedom that Christ set us free. Therefore, keep standing firm and do not be subject again to a yoke of slavery. So this is cool. If you've trusted in Christ as your Savior, then the Bible says that God has applied His righteousness to your account. Sometimes people say, yeah, but Jesus' righteousness has been applied to my account. Well, if you mean in Jesus' divinity, that Jesus as God, His righteousness has been applied to your account, then yes. But the Scripture actually says God's righteousness is applied to your account. So think about that. God isn't just a righteous thing, as in a good thing. He is goodness itself. He's righteousness itself. That has been applied to your account as a believer in Christ. So you don't have to worry about living the good life in order for God to love you or any of those sorts of things. He's freed you from worrying about those things so you can then go live as you ought to live, as He conforms you more to the image of Christ day by day. Again, and that is a matter of the will also. Now, if you've never trusted in Christ as your Savior, I don't know any of you other than a couple of you. If you've never trusted in Christ as your Savior, I promise you that is the only place there is freedom. And we have reason to believe that it is true freedom. It is real love that can lead to real change. It doesn't mean if you're struggling with some behavior or desire or whatever, that'll just magically go away, because it probably won't. And actually, it may get even tougher if we're honest. Because God's wonderful plan for your life doesn't mean the easy life now, despite what Joel Osteen may say. The struggle is real, and sometimes that just is the process that God has for us, the sanctification process. But we have reason to believe it's actually true. It actually will change your life. And that's what Ratio Christi is all about. So if you're new tonight, or if you're still exploring these things, I hope you'll continue searching and exploring and reaching, because God does promise if we're searching for Him with all our hearts, we will find Him, because He's not that far from any one of us. So as I said, ultimately that true love and that true life change is found in God, because He is the final end, the ultimate purpose towards which we're all directed. And He wants to take us in our purely natural states and do a supernatural work in our lives for His glory. So to conclude just real quickly, a truly safe space is a place where we tell the truth. In love, in respect, in gentleness, but where we tell the truth, where we will what is ultimately good for people, not what they have to think or feel or want, but we love them enough to will what is actually good for them. So there's little doubt that those leading the Safe Space Initiative are fueled by what they understand love to be, but it's a misdirected love that promotes man's will over reality. And that is dangerous. That's not safe. And it's certainly not love. So I am going to stop the screen share so that I can see you again. And if you guys have any questions, please feel free.
What if you came back and no one was here?
Well, I wouldn't have blamed them.
All right, questions. I know that he's probably hit on lots of things that are agree, disagree. This is the place to ask good questions and seek good answers. So all questions are good.
Hey, no, I didn't say anything about that.
ask lots of questions, then we'll leave. All right, Madison, then Ashley.
Yes, so I know someone who's very, very adamant that Christians as a whole should not necessarily affirm their behavior, but affirm their decision to be whatever gender they are. And that as loving Christians in a loving Christian community, we should use their preferred pronoun. And my struggle with that is that it's affirming them and using that instead of showing and living a lifestyle that's a witness to saying that is not what I think is true and right for you. So what would be like your best case for how to deal with that particular person in the church?
Oh, goodness. Yeah, I don't know that there is any easy answer to that. And it's probably going to be somewhat different, at least tactically speaking, on a case-by-case basis, depending on your relationship with the person and those sorts of things. Alan Shellman, I think that's how you say his last name, from Stand to Reason. He just actually wrote a blog or a video or something he did that I read just last week, I believe it was, with his thoughts about this, which I would point you to, this str.org, Stand to Reason. Alan Shellman, I think is how you say his last name, is one of their speakers. So that would be a good resource for you. I think the guiding principle, again, is going to be not violating your own conscience in respecting them as well. So, we're not just going up, well, it violates my conscience to use those pronouns, so buddy, I'm going to call you he regardless of what you think. We're certainly not going to approach it that way. But, if they are asking something of us, which is fair, they can ask, why cannot we do the same? Hey, we're friends. I do love you. So if you want me to respect you enough to, have to use these made-up words and this sort of stuff that you want me to use, just to affirm and celebrate this decision that you've made, well, how about you love me enough to realize that violates my conscience? And so maybe we can find a happy medium here as we navigate this situation. And I'll do my best not to disrespect you, and you do your best to appreciate where I'm coming from as well. And again, that's just, you're going to have to use wisdom depending on your relationship with those people, I think, those situations.
Ashley, do you have a question?
When you asked us what is love, my question is, what does love mean to you, and do you apply it to your everyday life?
What does love mean to me? Well, I think it means, as I defined it, at least when we're talking about love in this particular context, to will the good of another. And no, I don't think any of us apply that consistently in the way that we should in our daily lives, which is yet another reason why we all need a Savior and the one who is perfect love. You can just ask my wife how well I apply that on a daily basis, because I certainly fail every day, as I'm sure most all of us do. But that is the desire, right? It is my desire to will her good and the good of my kids and the good of others, as far as that goes, consistently on a daily basis. But I'm a fallen, selfish human being who's been saved by grace, so I fail daily, yes.
And I think you would say, correct me if I'm wrong, that that's not just your definition. You think that is the definition.
Right, yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm.
So we're not just talking about what it means to you, we're talking about what does it mean.
Right,
objectively.
right.
Lexi.
Can you hear me from back there?
Just bring
Okay, so the study that you referenced, the Hopkins study. I was in a conversation with someone recently about that study, and they made the case that the reason there is so much post-surgery regret is because of the unwillingness of society to accept them. And they argue if society did accept them, there would not be the same numbers of post-surgery regret / suicide. What would be your thoughts on that?
I just saw Ben Shapiro. If you guys aren't familiar with him, he's a sharp guy. I was watching one of his YouTube videos the other week, and he was quoting some stats. He's just brilliant. I mean, he just spout off all of these stats and everything that I'm completely incapable of doing. but someone asked him a similar question, and he said, if that is really, if just being not affirmed or not celebrated or being made fun of or whatever the case may be, not that I'm advocating any of those things, but if those types of reactions from people really fuel this suicide rate and all these sorts of things, if that is really the reason, then why do we see, if this is such a racist country and we've been through slavery and done all these things in this nation, why is the suicide rate amongst the African American population drastically lower than any other population? Because if anyone's been offended and belittled and all those sorts of things, we can certainly make the case that it would be that portion of society. Yet that portion of society has the lowest suicide rate of anyone, I think, or at least one of the lowest. So just those sorts of counterexamples, I think, help alleviate that narrative and show that there's more to the story here. There's more going on. And ultimately, what it boils down to, just logically speaking, if it is the fact that disagreeing with someone's lifestyle choices or behavior leads them to suicide or harmful behaviors, then does that mean the person who disagrees with me wants me to kill myself? Because they're disagreeing with me. They're not affirming me. Sometimes I'm belittled and called names and other things. So does that mean they want me to go commit suicide? Well, hopefully not. But if that's the argument, that not affirming someone's behaviors leads to suicide, you're not affirming my behavior, therefore, what naturally follows from that if you're going to be consistent? So again, I think it's just a talking point that when it actually is compared to reality, compared to the numbers, it does not stand up to scrutiny.
Okay, Kunal, and then, yeah.
Why do people who are gay, from the earliest time they can remember, why are they only attracted to the same sex? Does this have something to do with a lack of father figure as growing up?
Yeah, I can't answer that question authoritatively. There's a lot of debate on that. Is it nature? Is it nurture? Is it a combination of both? Which I would say it probably is a combination of both. But ultimately, whether that behavior is good or not, it's irrelevant to the cause of that behavior. So, even someone who, we used the example of alcoholism earlier, someone has a completely 100% genetic disposition to alcoholism, if that's even possible. It doesn't mean that alcoholism is good. Someone that was born blind, it doesn't mean that their eyes shouldn't see. So someone born with these particular desires or behaviors, perhaps that means we have that much more compassion on them than we should already have. We should already have compassion. But maybe that just means we have that much more compassion. But it doesn't change the fact that those behaviors are not good, not that towards which we're directed. But as not an authority on the psychology or genetics of the issues, I can't speak authoritatively to that. So sorry, probably not the answer you wanted, but that's the best I got.
What are your opinions on conversion therapy and people who advocate conversion therapy?
What are your opinions on conversion therapy and those who advocate conversion therapy?
Yeah, a little bit outside of my area. When you get to the nitty-gritty of that stuff, I'm more in the philosophy side of things. But from the little bit that I do know about it, which is very little, I think it's a mixed bag. I don't think there's necessarily a blanket answer. It depends on what kind of therapy you're talking about. How is it occurring? What are the motivations behind it? What are the end goals of it? All those sorts of questions. I don't know that we could give a blanket good or bad answer to that, because I do certainly think people can change, and we have plenty of testimonies of people who have changed. But there are also horror stories of people who went through terrible types of quote-unquote conversion therapy that no one should have been subject to. So again, I think it's a mixed bag there.
And if you want a good testimony, Rosario Butterfield she's got her videos all over the internet, but she's a really interesting testimony to someone who came out of that lifestyle and is now a believer. Sarah?
So I had a friend who was is an atheist, and she's actually a lesbian too. And we were having a conversation about transgenderism, and she said that Christians are very inconsistent because her understanding is that transgenderism is like you're cutting off a part of your body, or you're adding a part of your body that it isn't supposed to be there or that you would like there. And so Christians should also be against elective surgeries such as like breast implants and things like that. So we should be against everything like that if we're against transgenderism.
Yeah, at times there's certainly something to be said for that. Just because we may be right, at least I'm convinced we're right in one issue, doesn't necessarily mean we're consistent across the board with the application of that. So yeah, I mean, there are certain types of surgeries and various things that we're perfectly legal and we're capable of doing that I would say we probably shouldn't do. But just because Christians may be inconsistent in that doesn't change the fact that the other argument they're making for transgenderism or whatever is still a sound argument. Maybe they just live it out inconsistently because we all are inconsistent in some aspects. I would flip it. I'm not telling you this is a tactic, but just as a talking point in this particular discussion, I noticed this at UNC Greensboro, and so I would flip it in this way and say that the atheist club folks that I was friends with at UNC Greensboro were always on the bandwagon with whatever the latest social issue was that they could advocate for or protest against or whatever the case may be. And so transgenderism and those sorts of things were a big one. But I'm thinking, okay, not all atheists are metaphysical naturalists, okay, if you guys know what that means. So that means you don't believe in anything other than the physical, okay, if you're a metaphysical naturalist. So some atheists believe in immaterial aspects of reality, but a lot of atheists are metaphysical naturalists. That is, they don't believe in anything other than the physical. But they're advocating for all these transgender types of rights and all these sorts of things as good. And I'm thinking, how can you do that on your view? Because on your view, there is no soul. There is nothing immaterial about you to inhabit the wrong physical body. If you're consistent in your views, you're just your molecules. And your molecules are what they are. You can't be a woman trapped in a man's body because there is no womanness on this metaphysical view. And so it's completely inconsistent. So inconsistency happens, but it doesn't change the reality of the arguments that are being made. Sorry if you hear my kids in the background.
All right, so I had just a quick comment to make. It's kind of a connection to what you had said earlier. It's a couple verses from Matthew chapter 7, verses 24 through 27. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. So all that to say, I saw a connection in that when we build our house, I think he gave us a great charge to build with wisdom, to be that wise man and build on the rock, which is obviously Jesus' teachings and his practices based upon what he says in regards to certain issues. And I think the foolish one is whenever the winds come and the rains come, that's the ways of this world and the culture trying to maybe attack our views and what we believe. So I guess I'm just complimenting the uncompromising charge that you're giving to us to stand firm in what we do believe and to speak up for the truth and what we find to be true in God's Word. So I wanted to thank you for that. I found that
yeah, absolutely. And again, of course, all of this is kind of a nuts and bolts presentation. This is not necessarily a tactical presentation. So all of these things, as we're communicating these truths with our friends or our loved ones or with the culture at large, we're doing this in gentleness, with respect, out of a motivation of love, of pursuing the good for this person, not out of a motivation of proving my views right and proving them wrong or beating them into submission argumentatively or whatever the case may be. So yes, thank you for that, and please just keep in context the way in which we're to go about doing this.
Samuel, do you have one?
Yeah, Adam, on your first point on what is good, what has been most beneficial in your study in that question, and would you recommend a book on that topic?
Oh yeah, great question. So there's a lot of good stuff. One I would highly recommend. It's kind of jumping in the deep end, but it's awesome. And I will say it's a little polemical. So there are a few choice words in there, and the author is a Catholic, which I am not, so I disagree with him theologically on some issues, but philosophically I think he's spot on. So Ed Feser, F-E-S-E-R, The Last Superstition is an amazing book. It's just a philosophical refutation of the new atheism. So he's basically answering Richard Dawkins in a Richard Dawkins-esque style. So he's pretty blunt and a little sarcastic and snarky at times, but he says, look, I'm just answering him the way he talks about Christians. So I think that's called for at times, and that's what that book's about. There's another one by, let me look it up real quick, can't remember his name. It's called Making Gay Okay. Excellent book. The author is, I got it on my Kindle app here, if I can pull it up real quick. It's on the tip of my tongue, but I just can't remember what his name is. Making Gay Okay. And so it goes through kind of the history of thought, nominalism, and those sorts of things that we talked about tonight, and kind of how we got to where we are in this culture. Here it is. It is Robert Riley is his name. So very good book. And then Michael Brown, from a more kind of pastoral standpoint, Can You Be Gay and Christian? I have not read the whole thing, but what I have read of it, he deals with the suicide issue and stuff very compassionately. And you're not going to find anyone who, he's not a philosopher, so he doesn't get into the deep end of what we talked about tonight, but as far as biblically and pastorally, someone who's going to just approach this with the utmost love and respect, but completely uncompromising, you're probably not going to find anybody better than Michael Brown on that.
He also wrote a really good book, Queer Thing Happened to America, that's sort of just a history of homosexual movement. Really good. Again, he's very fair and even-handed in his discussion, but he is discussing it. Yeah, one or two more questions? One more question?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, could you just repeat the title of Feser's book?
Yeah, The Last Superstition. It's F-E-S-E-R.
I gave it to us again.
Yeah, I know I have.
Any other questions? Sarah Kate, you have
I have another question.
Yeah.
What would you say when it comes to Christian leaders that are really well known in this, probably in this nation, that have made their stance known that they're pro-homosexual? Like, would you say, or that they think that homosexuality that you can be Christian? Would you say that it's beneficial for Christians to not follow, to not follow that person anymore, like in their teachings, or just, I don't know what the best way is to go about that with they've written books prior to that and everything, so.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and it's not always an easy answer, because that certainly doesn't mean that everything they say from here on out is going to be wrong. They can still communicate very profound truths, but I would say, yes, you would have to be extremely cautious. Anybody that we listen to and follow, I mean, we all get things wrong from time to time, but some things are a little more significant than others, and some things are a little more obvious and clear than others and have more implications. So my opinion, this is just my opinion here, I'm not saying it's definitely the right answer, but my opinion would certainly be there are plenty of good people out there to listen to and follow that you don't have to be quite as worried about. We always have to be discerning, of course. But yeah, there are plenty of other people out there to listen and to follow. So if that were to happen to someone I was currently reading or following or whatever, I would probably tend to not do so anymore.